Hi there. So several years ago, I was joined by a woman. This woman has stood out among thousands of travelers that I've hosted over the years. We were doing a trip up in the Canadian Arctic, and the trip had a pretty specific goal. At the welcome dinner, this woman, she announced that she had her own goal as well. It took us aback a little bit, and then she described what her goal was. Of course, we were there to encounter polar bears out in the wild in the Canadian Arctic. And she had come specifically because she had, over the years, given small sums of money to a conservation organization that supported polar bears and Arctic conservation. And she was now considering donating a very large sum of money to that same organization. And so she had come to experience polar bears for herself, to learn more about the bears, more about the Arctic, to hear about conservation initiatives, and to see her for herself what these research programs were like and where her conservation donations were going. Basically what her gift would support. So this woman, Susan, she was exceptional in many ways, but in one way she fit the typical mold of an adventure traveler. She desired to know more about the conservation of the planet's wild places, and that's what caused her to seek new travel experiences. So thanks for being here with me today. Again, my name is Colby. I'm a senior polar guide with the PTGA, and I am currently sitting on the board of directors as well. We're happy to be hosting these webinars through the month of April. The program is part of a larger initiative to provide unique benefits for our members and build a camaraderie, a community within the polar realm. And these April webinars are a little different, though. They're for everybody, So thanks for taking time away from the Tiger King and the ongoing saga of the Resolute to be here today. We do appreciate it. It's nice to feel part of the community here. And tell your friends. So for the month of April, even if folks aren't PTGA members, they're welcome to join these, as you've probably noticed on the Polar Guides group. Now, you might be wondering how Susan's trip turned out. So we did see a lot of bears on that trip. And ultimately, by the trip's end, Susan did decide to donate a large sum of money to the conservation organization of her choice. But not only that, her enthusiasm was so contagious that several of the other travelers on that same trip donated as well. So it was very special. But again, Susan was exceptional. So the question is, how can we spark the same enthusiasm within the typical adventure traveler? I'm going to switch over here to some slides, mostly so you don't have to look at me the whole time, but I do have some slides that actually illustrate some of the things I'll be talking about later on as the show goes on. I'd like to acknowledge that the aim here is to keep this at about 15 minutes, so I'll be focusing mostly on big picture concepts. But if you have any questions, just leave them in the comment box. We have a lot of technology going on, but at the end of the presentation here, I'll be fed some questions from Lauren, and I can answer some of those questions for you if some of the things weren't clear or you wanted some other ideas to be thrown out. And then I'm happy to follow up on any comments that people leave on Facebook later on as well. So, as polar guides, we're privileged to introduce people from around the world to the polar environment. And as we're out exploring, it's easy to throw around facts, figures, and superlatives to entertain your guests, or to ride the excitement of wildlife encounters and successful physical challenge. More challenging is for us to find the time to speak to larger issues surrounding conservation and stewardship. I'm here to tell you that being informed of conservation initiatives and challenges is something that your guests desire. And that recap is often a good place to do it. But how exactly does that work? Well, to start, let's take a minute to explore the idea of conservation within the context of adventure travel. I was speaking recently with my friend Court Whalen. Court's the Director of Sustainability and Conservation Travel at NatHab. And he had a nice way of thinking about this, and I think it's worth sharing. So Court noted that most travelers expect and want to learn things during travel. It's a core reason for seeking new experiences. And so conservation aside, travelers should be taught about the things that are most topical, relevant, and connected to the areas they're visiting. In the polar realm, conservation just happens to be one of the most relevant topics right now. And so it's a no-brainer to be a core subject of teaching and conversation in today's polar travel. And when I say conservation here, I'm wrapping up all sorts of ideas and issues that range from explaining small-scale best practices and visitor guidelines to more heavily charged issues like subsistence hunting and fisheries management. And of course, is the granddaddy of them all, climate change. And our travelers do seek this discussion. There's plenty of marketing data that clearly shows that a significant portion of adventure travelers join trips expecting to learn more about these special areas and to become advocates and stewards for them. So the take-home message is that we're doing a great service to our guests by introducing them to conservation goals, initiatives, and opportunities. And this is something we should be doing. Now, here's the hurdle. Speaking of conservation initiatives, as we all know, can be challenging. You may not have specific expertise with the topic. Subject matter may be intimidating. We often avoid politically charged topics, especially in mixed groups of people, and it can be difficult to find the right time for these discussions. But these hurdles, they're actually very easy to surmount. So a few ideas on that for you. As far as expertise, I can tell you that you don't have to be an expert on everything, and no one is expecting you to be. Your job is that of a guide, that of a facilitator. Your guests rely on you to simply introduce them to new places, wildlife, experiences, and ideas. This demands a high level of subject knowledge about a wide range of topics, but it doesn't demand expertise. And it's okay to acknowledge that to your guests. Imagine that you're presenting to a group of travelers saying something like, now that you know a little bit more about this thing, whatever it is, I'd like to share what's happening at the moment from a management perspective. I'm certainly not an expert in the legal side of things or in the political arena, but I do know that this place or this creature is important, and there's some important things happening with it at the moment. Anyway, you get the gist. The thing is that our travelers look up to us, and if something is important to you, regardless of your expertise, it's of inherent interest to them as well. Another easy way into conservation topics is by talking about research. In this case, you have stories of real people doing real, tangible things. Sharing stories and imagery from the field programs is fun and interesting. It connects your guests emotionally, and it makes for an easy transition into what research outcomes will be. Why the research is important leads to the broader management and conservation goals. And if you yourself have been involved in polar research programs, then certainly don't miss this opportunity to share. Okay, so if your job is to simply raise awareness, then the corollary is that you are not there to make judgment decisions on what is right or wrong. You're only there to bring attention to what's happening on both sides of an issue. In this way, you can mostly avoid triggering political discussions, or at least you've provided yourself an easy way out in case some hothead comes storming at you. As far as intimidation, this all comes down to the tone you set. Recap and all of your discussions should be positive and fun. Speaking of conservation, then, is no exception. Focus on highlighting wins for the conservation movement and the good work people, organizations, and government are doing. And since you're not the expert, finish by providing ways that they can learn more. So notice that this method, it solves all of your problems. You provided a light and fun atmosphere, you've disarmed any preconceived notions about you being the ultimate expert, and your objectivity allows your guests to feel however they want to feel about a subject based on their own values. Okay, so that brings us to the final challenge of finding the right time of this. We're getting closer to talking about recap itself. Here's a nice quote from Sir David Attenborough that I think frames this part up nicely. No one will protect what they don't care about, and no one cares about what they've never experienced. So simply put, your guests need to experience something for themselves before they are going to be ready to receive more complex ideas about conservation. And it's in the field where you set that stage. The best guides help travelers engage with whatever is happening in the moment. This is the time to facilitate the emotional buy-in that will prepare your guests to receive more complex conservation information at a later time. Ensure people see or find things of interest, explain wildlife behaviors to them, use metaphors to help them relate new experiences to the things they already know, and create a sense of place. One step further is to enhance the guest experience. Encourage them to sit still and watch what is happening around them. Ask them to describe how the experience is making them feel, or take pictures of them so they can remember themselves in that moment. Then allow guests quiet time to process and internalize what they've experienced. This can occur while still in the field, back in camp, or back aboard your vessel. What will your guests remember as time passes? They'll remember how the experience made them feel. They develop a story in their mind while the facts and the figures all fade away. For instance, they won't remember that a humpback whale weighs 66,000 pounds and is 50 feet long, but they will remember how exciting it was when they saw the whale breach. They care about their own story. And there's Attenborough's word again. They now care. So recap. Here we are. To me, recap can be any type of follow-up that builds upon the experiences and emotions of the day. Recap can encompass many different forums, and you should feel empowered to feel out your guests to determine how and when they might want to receive more sophisticated information about the thing that they now care about. By recap, our travelers now possess a personal connection to the places and the wildlife of the region, and they have an invested interest in knowing about it more deeply. This is your moment. I think many of us recognize recap as the traditional roundup. We do this with shipboard travelers where guides take turns highlighting the day's encounters and adventures. And the slightly more formal forum of recap provides a wonderful opportunity to introduce conservation topics, and it's common to a great many polar expeditions. So a few notes about what formal recap might look like, I think, are merited. Firstly, recap should be entertaining. Rehash the highlights of the day, add context, tell personal stories, and reignite that emotional connection. You should be making it fun. It should be engaging. Recap should also be germane to the day. Usually, discussing things that travelers experienced in the last 24 hours is important. And I say usually because personally, I think there's often more room for one naturalist to go off on a tangent and tie themes of the trip together or provide a broader perspective. So consider that too. Recap should build upon your field talks. Make connections. Don't let new ideas live in a bubble. And then make sure that recap helps to solidify the sense of community within your expedition. The guests themselves, the staff, and the crew. Reinforce the talks of other guides, share in successes, and keep the energy high. And cocktails, don't forget the cocktails. Once you've satisfied these things, then move into new territory. If you have, say, 7 minutes for your recap, perhaps dedicate the final 2 minutes to a conservation idea, remembering to highlight positive outcomes. Recap, though, it doesn't have to be so formal all of the time. And on some trips, it just can't be. This is especially true for trips like Arctic wilderness camps, or maybe you're traveling on smaller polar yachts. In these situations, a formal recap is going to seem out of place with the overall vibe of the trip. But in essence, recap is just building upon the experiences of the trip. So there are plenty of other ways to do that besides a formal recap. I found 2 methods work really well for opening the door, and I thought I'd share those with you. So personally, I create a binder of information for my guests that travels with me on each trip. It always contains general information about the area. It has maps, wildlife ID cards, infographics, that sort of thing. But then each day I put in additional articles, papers, and brochures related to what we experienced that day. Maybe that's current research on penguins or a project quantifying sea ice melting. And then I include related information about conservation programs from respective sources. And that binder just lives out in a common space where guests can access it wherever they have time. Later, in the off time, whatever that means for our trips, maybe it's while we're transiting or in between activities when things are being organized, I'll bring up the articles with my guests. And I'll say things like, hey, I noticed you were reading the article about whatever, or from this organization. Did you find it interesting? And that will usually lead to more discussion. Another thing that I do is I invite people sometimes to learn about conservation in a more direct way. It would be something like, hey, we have a couple hours of transiting time after lunch. If anybody wants to join me, I'd love to share some pictures of interesting research projects, maybe specific to this area that we're traveling through, how they're supporting an important management issue right now, that sort of thing. And many folks will jump on that opportunity. So how do we talk about conservation? Remember to keep it positive. So there's 2 slides up right now. They're both sort of celebrating the creation of these marine protected areas, one in the Arctic and one in the Antarctic. And these are great examples of how to keep things positive. You can show what conservation work is succeeding, and that's a great way to get people engaged, of course. Remember that you're entertaining your guests here, right? So by keeping it positive, that helps them continue to feel alive and energized during their holiday. Don't take that away from them, and don't allow the subject matter to be intimidating. Also, be aware of your language. Are you speaking of conservation issues? How many of you want to get involved with an issue during your holiday? I don't think I do. How about instead we talk about conservation ideas or conservation goals or current management goals, that sort of thing. And then also be sparing. Certainly don't force these topics into any and all situations. Look for natural conversation starters. Include these ideas periodically and recognize when you'll get the most bang for your buck. Your job is, remember, to raise awareness. And those of you who have struck a chord, they'll seek out more information from you. And then finally, share how you're personally involved and invested in a certain matter. Do you donate? Do you volunteer? Did you personally participate in any field research? This is all of great interest to your guests, of course, inherently, but also because they now know you personally as well. So let's talk about the follow-through then. Here's a little bit of an outline that I generated about this method that I like. At this point, you've introduced your guests to these wonderful places. You've established an emotional connection to those places. You've introduced conservation topics, and you've inspired your guests to get involved. So the final step is getting them to walk through the door that you opened. So highlight ways that they can personally become involved. Bulletin boards, brochures, binders, these are all good ways of transferring information. Also highlight citizen science initiatives and invite guests to participate with you while on the trip. For ideas on that, be sure to check out what projects the Polar Citizen Science Collective has going on right now. And don't forget to make yourself available to speak with guests on a more personal level. Aha! So to recap, we know that our guests desire to learn about conservation and stewardship. We also know that they look up to us as ambassadors of the places we ourselves love. If a conservation matter is important to us, there's a good chance it will become important for them too. So what story do you want your guests to tell their friends and family when they return home? I'll argue that carrying knowledge about larger conservation, management, and ecological initiatives is worth far more than superlative information about how big or how long-lived something is. Remember that most of our guests don't want to be mere tourists. They desire a more intimate understanding of a place, and they desire to be good stewards and advocates of the land and sea. They just need you to tell them how. Okay, that's generally what I have for you today. Again, thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules right now. If you're left thinking, all right, Colby, that's all great. I like your ideas, but I'm just not sure how to actually take that conversation from what we're seeing to the field to the conservation topics. What you're looking to know more about is thematic interpretation. And that's the one thing that's glaringly missing from this whole methodology, is how exactly to execute that. Good news is that we have a talk coming up this month on thematic interpretation. So do be sure to check that out and all of the other talks that we have going on for the month of April. And I think that leaves it to some questions. And Lauren, if you're listening, I'm not receiving anything from you right now. So how about we'll do this? Thank you everybody for being here. I really appreciate it. If you do have questions, feel free to email me. You can rewind that video and see the email that I had up for a moment there, or just leave it in the comments here on Facebook and I'll get to them at a later time. Thanks a lot for being here. I appreciate it. Take care. Stay healthy. I am done.